In the velvet-draped heart of Verona's, Chicago's most exclusive Italian restaurant, Alara moved like a ghost between worlds of wealth she could only serve. The hushed power of men in tailored suits was the backdrop to her exhaustion. Tonight, that world turned on her. A careless shoulder from a boisterous stockbroker sent a full tray of aged whiskey crashing to the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent dining room. Before she could even apologize, the manager, a man whose authority was built on humiliating his staff, loomed over her. His voice, a venomous hiss for the benefit of the surrounding tables, sliced through the air. "On your knees," he commanded, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You'll clean that up with your tongue." But what happened in the seconds that followed would change her life forever, and if you watch until the end, you will see exactly how. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Alara was 24, an art history student whose hands, meant to study the delicate brushstrokes of Renaissance masters, were calloused from carrying trays. Her days were spent in dusty libraries, dreaming of Florence, but her nights were spent here, navigating a labyrinth of quiet arrogance and cold transactions. She possessed a silent dignity, a way of holding her shoulders back that defied her worn-out server's uniform. This resilience was her armor, forged in a past marked by a quiet, gnawing loss that had taught her the high cost of integrity. She was a woman fighting to remain whole in a city determined to break her into manageable pieces, her spirit a flickering candle in a storm. The restaurant itself was an opulent cage. The low, confident hum of conversations about mergers and acquisitions blended with the soft clinking of crystal against crystal. The air, thick with the scent of truffle oil and expensive cologne, felt heavy in her lungs. Her manager, Mr. Valenti, patrolled the floor like a predator, his gaze a constant, oppressive weight. He thrived on the small, daily cruelties that reminded his staff of their place, and Alara was a frequent target of his thinly veiled contempt. For him, her quiet defiance was not a sign of strength, but an invitation for discipline, a challenge to his fragile authority in this kingdom of powerful men, where he was merely a court jester. Her solitude was a constant companion, a silent space she retreated into amidst the noise. Moving between tables, she was a collector of moments, of overheard whispers and dismissive glances. She saw the chasm between their lives and hers, not just in wealth, but in a fundamental disconnect from consequence. Her own moral compass, a legacy from a father who had lost everything standing up for what was right, felt like an archaic, useless instrument in this modern coliseum. She felt profoundly stuck, pinned in place not only by student debt and rent, but by an unwavering sense of justice in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of the word. The amber liquid spread across the pristine white marble, the shards of shattered glass glittering like cruel jewels under the soft lights. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating, a familiar poison. Her gaze flickered to the stockbroker, who had already turned back to his laughing friends, her existence already forgotten. The manager's order hung in the air, a public sentence designed to strip away the last of her dignity. Her hands, clasped in front of her, trembled not from fear of the mess, but from the searing humiliation of the command. To kneel felt like a surrender of her very soul, a confirmation of the worthlessness he saw in her. The silence that followed was a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides. It was a silence filled with the hungry curiosity of the diners, their faces a mixture of pity, amusement, and detached interest. Every eye was a pinprick on her skin. She could hear her own heart thundering in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. The sharp, peaty scent of the spilled whiskey felt like an accusation, clinging to the air around her. Her entire world had shrunk to this one spot on the floor, this single, impossible choice between defiance and survival, a stage where her spirit was about to be broken. From a shadowed corner booth, where the darkness seemed to cling to the tailored lines of a suit, a profound stillness emanated. Alara, trapped in her vortex of public shame, was unaware of it at first. But the very atmosphere in the room began to shift, the ambient tension tightening around a new, unseen center of gravity. It was a presence she had never noticed before, a quiet power that absorbed all the noise and chaos without effort. A cold, prickling sensation traced its way up her spine, the distinct and unnerving feeling of being watched, not with the fleeting pity of the crowd, but with a focused, predatory intensity. The late-night bus ride home was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the weary sighs of strangers. Alara rested her forehead against the cool, vibrating glass, watching the opulent storefronts of Chicago blur into streaks of gold and crimson. Her server's uniform, a crisp, black dress, felt like a costume she couldn't shed, clinging to her skin with the faint scent of expensive wine and other people's contentment. Each stop brought on more tired faces, each a reflection of her own exhaustion. This city was a machine that ran on the dreams of people like her, grinding them down into fuel for the powerful. She was just another cog, silent and replaceable, moving through the dark veins of a metropolis that never truly slept. Her apartment was a small, third-floor walk-up that smelled of turpentine and old books. It was her sanctuary, the only place where she was not a servant but a scholar, a dreamer. Art history texts were stacked precariously on every surface, their pages filled with the genius of masters who had turned pain into beauty. On a small easel by the window, a charcoal sketch of a Florentine bridge remained unfinished, a monument to a future that felt more distant with each passing day. An eviction notice, tucked beneath a magnet on the refrigerator, was a stark, paper-thin reminder of the fragile wall between her quiet dignity and the unforgiving street below, a constant, low hum of anxiety. The nightly phone call with her mother was a ritual of carefully chosen words. Alara would describe the restaurant as elegant, and her job as challenging, omitting the casual cruelties and the bone-deep weariness. Her mother's voice, frail and thinned by illness, was a fragile thread connecting her to a past where she felt safe. She sent most of her earnings home to cover medical bills, a duty she carried without complaint, but with the heavy weight of a daughter watching her parent fade from a distance. The lie of her well-being was a necessary armor, a small kindness she could offer when she had so little else to give, each cheerful word a small betrayal of her own reality. Days were a stark contrast, spent in the hallowed, dusty halls of the university. In the darkened lecture rooms, surrounded by images of Renaissance masterpieces, she felt her spirit awaken. She saw the world not as it was, but as it could be, a canvas for courage, passion, and profound human expression. Her professor often praised her insights, seeing in her a rare, intuitive understanding of the emotional weight behind each brushstroke. But the spell would always break. A glance at her watch would send a jolt of dread through her, pulling her from the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany back to the suffocating velvet confines of Verona's, where her intellect was worthless. Mr. Valenti's tyranny was a constant, corrosive drip of acid on her spirit. He patrolled the dining room with the smug assurance of a man who wielded his small power like a weapon. He would find fault in the precise angle of a fork, the speed of her walk, the quietness of her voice. His criticisms were never about her work. They were about her existence. He seemed to resent her composure, the unyielding dignity she carried in her posture. To him, she was a puzzle he wanted to break apart. And he chipped away at her daily with passive-aggressive comments and impossible demands. His pleasure derived from the slow, methodical erosion of her self-worth. The other servers moved through their shifts with a practiced cynicism, their smiles as much a part of the uniform as their aprons. Maria, a veteran of the restaurant, had once advised her to become smaller, to blend into the wallpaper until she was invisible. "They can't hurt what they can't see," she'd whispered during a shared cigarette break in the grimy back alley. But Alara couldn't bring herself to disappear. Her father had taught her that integrity was the one thing no one could take from you unless you gave it away. So she held her ground, her quiet defiance, a lonely, exhausting act of rebellion in a world that rewarded compliance. Still, moments of grace would break through the gloom. An elderly couple, celebrating their 50th anniversary, thanked her not for the service, but for her gentle smile, for making them feel seen. A child, bored at his parents' table, would show her a drawing, and for a fleeting minute, She would see the world through his unfiltered eyes. These small connections were her lifeblood, brief flashes of genuine humanity that reminded her of the world she dreamed of, a world built on empathy, not transactions. They were the flickers of light that kept the oppressive darkness of Verona's from consuming her completely, a testament to the person she was fighting to remain. The pressure was not just emotional, but crushing and tangible. A text message from her bank flashed on her phone screen. Student loan payment declined. A cold knot of panic tightened in her stomach. She had been juggling payments for months, a desperate financial dance of paying one bill with money meant for another. The dream of studying in Florence wasn't just a fantasy. It was a promise she had made to herself, a finish line that seemed to recede further with every bill that arrived. She felt trapped in a cycle of servitude, working a job that stripped her of her spirit simply to pay for an education that was supposed to set her free. In a rare moment of quiet before the evening rush, she stood in the cavernous wine cellar, the cool, damp air a brief respite from the performative heat of the dining room. Surrounded by vintage bottles, worth more than she would earn in a year, she felt the full weight of her circumstances pressed down on her. She was an observer of a life she would never lead, a silent witness to a feast she was not invited to. Her reflection in the dark glass of a cabinet showed a pale, tired woman, her eyes holding a sorrow that seemed ancient. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't recognize herself, seeing only the uniform and the exhaustion it represented. That night, the restaurant was buzzing with a particularly volatile energy. A table of stockbrokers, loud and flush with a recent market victory, demanded constant attention. Their laughter was sharp and arrogant, echoing off the marble floors. Ilara balanced a heavy silver tray, laden with glasses of the most expensive whiskey the restaurant served. She navigated the narrow space between tables, her muscles aching with fatigue. As she approached their table, one of the men stood up abruptly, turning without looking, his shoulder colliding with her tray. Time seemed to slow as the world tilted, a silent, terrible prelude to the crash that would shatter more than just glass. A profound shift occurred in the room's atmosphere, a sudden, palpable drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The scattered whispers of the diners died, the clinking of silverware ceased, and the oppressive weight of the manager's command was swallowed by a new, heavier silence. It was a silence born, not of shock, but of deference, a collective intake of breath that seemed to ripple outwards from a single point of origin. Ilara, still frozen in her circle of shame, felt it as a physical force, a change in pressure that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. Something, or someone, had just claimed ownership of the very air in the room, and she felt a primal, inexplicable fear grip her heart. He rose from the darkest corner booth, a place where the shadows seemed to be an extension of his presence. Dante Moretti was not a large man, but he moved with a gravitational pull that bent the room around him. His suit was a cut of midnight wool, so dark it seemed to absorb the low, golden light of the restaurant. There was an absolute stillness about him, a coiled economy of motion that spoke of immense, contained power. The other patrons, men of considerable influence themselves, averted their gazes, their bravado evaporating into a mist of quiet respect. He was a name spoken only in hushed tones, a legend of the city's underbelly who ruled with an iron will and a code that was as brutal as it was absolute. His eyes found hers across the room, and the world narrowed to the space between them. They were not the eyes of a businessman or a predator, but of something far older, like chips of obsidian that held the cold, detached history of 1,000 violent nights. There was no pity in his gaze, no anger, only a deep, unsettling stillness, an assessment. He saw past the uniform, past the spilled whiskey and the trembling hands. He saw the flicker of unbroken pride in her posture, the quiet defiance that refused to let her kneel. For a man who dealt in fractures and submission, her silent strength was a jarring, discordant note in the symphony of fear he usually conducted. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. When he spoke, The words were a low current of sound, calm and devoid of emotion, yet they carried the finality of a judge's sentence. "She is the new manager," Dante stated, his gaze shifting from Ilara to the stunned Mr. Valenti. The statement was not a suggestion or an order. It was a declaration of a new reality, as if he had the power to reshape the world with his voice alone. The sheer audacity of it hung in the air, more shocking than any shout could ever be. In that single sentence, he had erased Valenti's authority and rewritten Ilara's fate, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for the world to catch up to his words. Mr. Valenti's face, a moment ago a mask of cruel superiority, crumbled into a canvas of disbelief and terror. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The power he had so carefully curated within these velvet walls was revealed for what it was, a fragile illusion, shattered by the quiet will of a true king. He was a pawn who had just been swept from the board by a hand he hadn't even known was in the game. The stockbrokers at the nearby table were frozen, their faces pale, the spilled whiskey forgotten. Ilara watched, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the stunning, brutal efficiency of the power she was witnessing. It was a force of nature, swift and absolute. Dante's gaze remained fixed on the now trembling Valenti. "You're fired," he said, the words as simple and sharp as the flick of a blade. "Get out." There was no room for appeal. As if summoned by the words themselves, two men, dressed as impeccably as Dante, but with the unmistakable build of professional enforcers, materialized from the shadows near the entrance. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace, flanking Valenti without touching him. The threat was implicit, their presence a promise of what would happen if the command was not obeyed instantly. With a final, pathetic glance at the empire he had lost, Valenti was escorted out, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Then, the silence returned, deeper this time and filled with a new, terrifying tension. Dante began to walk toward her. Each footstep on the marble floor was a deliberate, resonant sound, the only sound in the entire restaurant. He moved through the tables not like a guest, but like the owner of the space, the air parting before him. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He was closing the distance between them, and with every step he took, she felt her small, ordered world tilting further off its axis. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the center of this man's attention, a position she instinctively knew was the most dangerous place to be. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The air around him smelled faintly of expensive wool, cold night air, and something else, something metallic and clean, like rain on stone. He was taller than she had realized, his shadow falling over her, enveloping her completely. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, and in that proximity, she saw the faint, silvery scar that traced the edge of his left eyebrow, a ghost of old violence etched onto his otherwise flawless, controlled features. It was a flaw in the marble, a hint of the man beneath the myth, and it was utterly terrifying. His obsidian eyes searched her face, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in them was replaced by something else. It was not kindness, but a flicker of profound, weary recognition, as if in her defiance he saw an echo of a principle he himself had once held, long before his world had been stripped of such things. He saw her not as a problem to be solved or a woman to be saved, but as a testament to a kind of integrity he thought no longer existed. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt more intimate than any touch. It was a silent contract, a binding of their fates she could not yet comprehend. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his dark suit melting back into the shadows from which it came. He was gone, but his presence lingered, a powerful charge left in the air. The diners began to breathe again, their hushed whispers returning, now laced with awe and fear. Ilara remained standing amidst the shattered glass, her body trembling, her mind reeling. The sharp scent of whiskey was gone, replaced by the faint, lingering scent of his cologne. She was no longer a servant, but a manager. She was no longer invisible. She had been seen by Dante Moretti, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would never be unseen again. Her new title was a crown of thorns. The staff at Verona's now moved around her with a hushed, fearful reverence, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She was no longer Ilara, the quiet art student. She was Dante Moretti's choice, a designation that marked her as both protected and owned. The restaurant, once a place of simple, oppressive labor, had become a gilded cage, every velvet curtain and polished surface reflecting her own unease. She managed the schedules and inventories in a state of surreal detachment, feeling like an actress in a play whose script she could not read, haunted by the ghost of the man who had placed her on this throne. He did not return as a guest. Instead, he materialized in the periphery of her new life, a silent, watchful specter. One night, as she locked the heavy oak doors, she found him leaning against his black sedan parked across the street, the city lights carving his silhouette from the darkness. He didn't speak or gesture, merely watched her with that unnerving stillness, his presence a silent inquiry into her safety, a confirmation of his continued influence. The distance between them felt charged with an invisible current, a silent conversation passing through the cold night air. Fear and a strange, unwelcome sense of security warred within her, leaving her breathless. She had tried to refuse the position. The morning after the incident, she had informed the restaurant's official owner, a nervous man named Mr. Russo, that she was grateful but unqualified. Russo had simply smiled, a thin, meaningless gesture. "Mr. Moretti does not make suggestions, Miss Vance," he'd said, his voice trembling slightly. "He creates circumstances." The words sealed her fate. She was trapped by a terrifying generosity, a promotion that felt more like a sentence. The salary, triple what she had earned before, was a golden shackle, solving her financial woes while binding her to a world she fundamentally opposed, forcing a daily compromise with her own conscience. Weeks later, she sought refuge in a dusty, forgotten bookstore near the university, the scent of aging paper a balm to her frayed nerves. As she traced the spine of a book on Caravaggio, a low voice beside her spoke. "He understood the darkness," it said. She turned, her heart stopping for a beat. It was Dante. He stood there, out of place in his impeccable suit amongst the towers of worn paperbacks, yet seeming to own the silence of the small shop. The collision of their two worlds in this quiet, scholarly space felt like a violation of a sacred boundary, a stark reminder that there was no corner of her life he could not reach. Her fear was momentarily eclipsed by instinct. "He painted the truth," she corrected softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "He knew that even in the deepest shadows, there is a desperation for light." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his obsidian eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of recognition. He studied her, not as a boss or a benefactor, but as an equal in this small, shared moment of intellectual curiosity. For the first time, she saw not the myth of the Mafia Boss, but the sharp, intelligent mind behind the mask, and the realization was more disarming than any threat could ever be. Dante watched her walk away from the bookstore, the small bell above the door announcing her departure. He had not gone there for the books. He had followed her. This pull towards her was an illogical, dangerous impulse, a deviation from the cold calculus that had governed his life for decades. Her simple, unwavering belief in the light, in the truth of beauty, was a forgotten language from a country he had long since been exiled from. She was a mirror reflecting a man he might have been, and the image was a source of both profound fascination and deep, visceral self-loathing. This woman was becoming a liability to his control. Back at Verona's, her newfound authority was tested. A city councilman, drunk on power and expensive wine, became belligerent, his complaints escalating towards a public scene. Ilara approached his table not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable calm. She listened, she acknowledged, and then, with a simple, direct firmness that offered no room for argument, she diffused the situation. She did not placate him. She commanded his respect without raising her voice. From his corner booth, unseen by her, Dante watched the entire exchange, a rare, almost imperceptible nod of approval his only reaction. He was witnessing the very integrity he'd recognized, now wielded as a quiet weapon. Later, when the restaurant had emptied, he He summoned her to his table with a subtle gesture. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension. She expected a comment on the councilman, an acknowledgement of her competence. Instead, he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit," he said, his voice low. "Tell me about the Florentine masters." The question was so unexpected it threw her off balance. He was not interested in the manager. He was interested in the art student. He was methodically dismantling the walls she kept between her two lives, seeking the person she was when she wasn't under his shadow, and it felt like a strategic, intimate invasion. As she spoke, her passion for the subject momentarily overriding her fear, she reached for her glass of water. At the same moment, he shifted a menu on the table, and the back of his hand brushed against her fingers. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a searing jolt through her entire body. It was like lightning striking in the silent room. His skin was unexpectedly cool, a stark contrast to the heat that flared in her own. Both of them froze, the world narrowing to that single, forbidden point of contact. A physical acknowledgement of the invisible current that had been flowing between them since that first night. She pulled her hand back as if she had been burned, her cheeks flushing with color. The carefully constructed wall of professional distance between them had been breached, and she felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed. She lost her train of thought, the names of Renaissance painters scattering from her mind like startled birds. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers, and in their depths she saw not a predator, but a man as caught off guard as she was. The silence that followed was heavier than any words, thick with everything they couldn't say, a shared moment of profound and dangerous connection. She quickly excused herself, needing to escape the suffocating intimacy of his gaze. Dante remained at the table long after she had fled to the relative safety of her small office. He stared at his hand, the place where her skin had met his. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her touch, a sensation that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. For years, his life had been a landscape of cold duty and calculated violence, his emotions locked away in a vault of iron control. This woman, with her quiet dignity and passionate spirit, was a key he never knew existed. The brief, accidental touch had unlocked something in him, a feeling he couldn't name, and it terrified him more than any rival's threat. The next evening, a shadow from the past returned. A brutish supplier, a man loyal to the ousted Valenti, cornered Alara in the cavernous, chilled wine cellar. Things were better before, he sneered, blocking her path, his physical presence an overt threat. Valenti knew how to keep things running smoothly. It'd be a shame if inventory started disappearing, or if a pretty new manager had an accident on her way home. The man's words were a cold slap of reality, a reminder that the world Dante had thrust her into had its own brutal rules, and she had just broken them by existing. Before she could respond, a deeper shadow fell over the cellar entrance. Dante stood there, his form framed by the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply existed, his presence a sudden, absolute drop in the room's temperature. The supplier turned, his bravado instantly evaporating into pure, primal fear. His face went ashen, and he began to stammer, a pathetic apology dying on his lips. Dante's gaze was a physical force, pinning the man in place, a silent promise of a pain far worse than any simple threat. The man scrambled past him and fled, his terror a lingering scent in the cool air. Now they were alone, surrounded by sleeping bottles of wine and a silence that was both a shield and a cage. Dante had not moved from the doorway, his body a barrier between her and the world that had just threatened her. The air was thick with her fear and his controlled rage. He had saved her, but his protection felt as dangerous as the threat itself. She could hear the soft, steady sound of his breathing, a calm rhythm in the chaotic aftermath of the confrontation. In that moment, he was not a mafia boss or a restaurant owner. He was a guardian, a dark angel standing vigil. Her voice was barely a whisper when she finally broke the silence. "Why?" The single word was freighted with the weight of the past few weeks. The promotion, the silent observations, this terrifying, swift justice. It was a plea for understanding, a demand for the truth behind his suffocating orbit. She needed to know why he had chosen her, Why he had entangled her life so completely with his own. Was she a pawn? A project? A whim? The not knowing was a torment, a constant, low-grade fear that undermined every waking moment and haunted her dreams. He finally moved, closing the distance between them in 2 slow, deliberate steps. He stopped just before her, his height and proximity overwhelming her senses. His dark eyes searched her face, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in their depths. A profound, ancient weariness. "Because integrity is a rare commodity in my world," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. "It's a currency more valuable than money or power. It deserves to be protected." It was a confession, an admission that in her, he saw something he had lost in himself. He reached out, his hand moving with an almost reverent slowness. She flinched, but he did not touch her skin. Instead, his fingers gently, almost tenderly, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, the gesture shockingly intimate. His touch was a ghost, a whisper of contact that made her breath catch in her throat. "But things worth protecting," he added, his voice dropping to a murmur that was for her alone, a secret shared in the cold, dark cellar. "Attract the worst kinds of predators. The man who just left is nothing. The real monsters are the ones you won't see coming." He let his hand fall, leaving her with the chill of his warning, a promise of a danger far greater than she could ever imagine. The warning he had given her in the wine cellar hung in the air between them for days, a ghostly presence in their silent exchanges. A fragile truce had formed, an unspoken acknowledgement of the dangerous ground they now shared. She managed his restaurant with a quiet, fierce competence, and he watched her from the shadows, his presence a constant, unnerving weight. But the peace was an illusion, a calm sea before a storm. The storm arrived on a Tuesday night, just as the last of the diners had departed. He came not with the bluster of a common thug, but with the chilling confidence of an equal. Silvio Falcone, a name spoken with the same hushed fear as Moretti's, stepped into the empty dining room, his smile as sharp and cold as the winter wind off the lake. Falcone moved through the room as if he owned it, his polished shoes silent on the marble. He ignored Dante, who sat in his corner booth, a statue carved from darkness, and walked directly to where Alara was overseeing the staff's closing duties. "A remarkable transformation," Falcone said, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. He ran a finger along the polished surface of a table. "This place used to have the soul of a morgue. You, my dear, have brought it to life." His eyes, unlike Dante's obsidian stillness, were restless and cruel. He was not admiring her work. He was appraising Dante's newest, most beautiful acquisition. And his contempt was a palpable thing, poisoning the air. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady, her posture unbent. This was her domain, a kingdom Dante had given her, and she would not let it be violated. "The restaurant is closed for the evening, sir," she said, her tone polite but laced with an unmistakable finality. It was a foolish, brave transgression. She was a civilian drawing a line in the sand against a warlord, choosing her side, not with a declaration of loyalty, but with a simple act of defending her space. She was no longer just a manager. She was the keeper of the gate, and she would not allow this serpent into her garden. Falcone's smile tightened, his amusement curdling into something uglier. His charm vanished like a snuffed candle. In a swift, brutal movement, he closed the distance and gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. "Don't you understand what you are?" he hissed, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of stale smoke and expensive liquor. "You're a decoration, a weakness he can't afford." The pain was sharp, but the humiliation was sharper. He was reducing her to a thing, a vulnerability to be exploited, proving his point by touching her with impunity right under Dante's nose. He was showing Dante that what he chose to protect, Falcone could choose to break. The silent room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable crack. The sound of Dante's chair scraping back against the marble floor was like a thunderclap in the stillness. He rose not with anger, but with a terrifying, preternatural calm, a force of nature gathering itself before it strikes. He moved from the shadows into the low light, and for the first time, Alara saw the true predator unmasked. There was no control in his eyes, only a cold, black, bottomless rage that promised utter annihilation. He did not look at her. His entire being, every ounce of his lethal focus, was aimed at the hand that dared to defile what he had claimed to protect. His slow, deliberate walk across the room was a funeral march, and Falcone was the guest of honor. He stopped a foot from them, yet the force of his presence felt like a physical blow. He still did not look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on Falcone's hand on her arm, a silent, all-consuming condemnation. "You have 3 seconds," Dante said, his voice so low it was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence, "to take your hand off her. And 1 second to regret you were ever born." It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. In that moment, he broke his oldest rule. Never let them see what you care for. He was laying his soul bare in the middle of his own dining room, exposing his one vulnerability to his greatest enemy. Falcone, caught in a fatal web of pride and miscalculation, sneered and tightened his grip. The consequence was immediate, a blur of motion so swift it defied the eye. Dante's hand shot out, not in a clumsy punch, but in a precise, devastating strike. His fingers clamped around Falcone's wrist, and with a sickening crack that echoed off the high ceilings, he shattered the bone. A raw animal scream tore from Falcone's throat as he staggered back, clutching his ruined hand, his face a mask of shock and agony. As if summoned from the very walls, Dante's men materialized, surrounding Falcone's enforcers, the transfer of power absolute and brutally efficient. As Falcone was dragged away, his screams fading into the night, a profound ringing silence descended upon the room. Ilara stood frozen, her arm throbbing where he had held her, her mind reeling from the stark, terrible violence she had just witnessed. Dante remained where he was, his body rigid, his breathing the only sound in the vast, empty space. The mask of the controlled, silent observer was gone, burned away by the fury of his actions. What stood before her was the raw, untamed force he kept chained in the dungeons of his soul, a monster he had just unleashed, not for power or for business, but for her. The sight of it was more terrifying and more intimate than any touch. He turned to her then, and the black rage in his eyes was gone, replaced by a blazing, desperate fire. He crossed the final distance between them, his movements urgent, almost frantic. He reached for her, and his hands, the same hands that had just shattered a man's bones, cupped her face with a shattering tenderness. It was not a gentle gesture. It was a desperate, grounding act, his thumbs stroking her skin as if to erase the memory of Falcone's touch, to confirm for himself that she was whole, that she was safe. He was anchoring himself to her, the only point of stillness in the violent storm of his own making, his touch a raw confession of everything he could never say. Her fear dissolved, washed away by a wave of stunning, absolute clarity. She saw him, not the mob boss, not the legend, but the man, undone by his own heart. He had broken his code, exposed his soul, and revealed the terrifying depth of his devotion. This was his truth. Trembling, she lifted her hand and placed it over his, covering his fingers where they rested against her cheek. The contact was an answer, a silent acceptance of the darkness she had just witnessed, and the man who wielded it. The world outside Verona's ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, bound together in the silent, sacred aftermath of his transgression, forever changed by a line they had just crossed together. The night that followed was a vacuum of silence. The dining room, scrubbed clean of any evidence of the conflict, felt unnervingly sterile, the air thick with the ghost of violence. Ilara moved through the space like a sleepwalker, her own heartbeat, a frantic, unsteady rhythm against the profound quiet. Dante was gone. His men had vanished as silently as they had appeared, leaving her in this opulent, echoing mausoleum. The touch of his hands on her face lingered like a brand, a searing memory of both terrifying tenderness and brutal power. He had broken the world to protect her, and in doing so, had shattered the fragile piece of her own. She was safe, but she had never felt more profoundly in danger, adrift in the wreckage of his love. Far across the city, in a penthouse office that floated above the bleeding lights of Chicago, Dante stood before a wall of glass, watching the rain lash against the window. He had retreated to the calculated fortress of his solitude, the only place where he could assess the damage. By defending her, he had publicly declared her his, painting a target on her back for every rival, every predator circling his empire. The act of protection had become the act of endangerment. A cold, familiar guilt settled in his gut. To keep her safe now, truly safe, he had to do the one thing his entire being rebelled against. He had to cut her out, excise her from his life like a surgeon removing a bullet, even if it meant bleeding out himself. Her days at Verona's became a lesson in hypervigilance. The luxurious comfort of the restaurant now felt menacing. Every shadow a potential threat, every new patron a possible enemy. The hushed reverence of the staff was now laced with fear, their glances a constant reminder of the power she represented and the danger she attracted. She performed her duties with a mechanical precision, her mind 1,000 miles away, replaying the sickening crack of bone and the desperate fire in Dante's eyes. The security he had given her had been a beautiful illusion. The reality was this gilded cage, where the bars were forged from his protection and her own growing fear. She was a queen in a kingdom under siege. A week into the suffocating silence, a black envelope appeared on her desk. It was heavy, made of thick, expensive cardstock, but it was unsigned. Inside, a single, typewritten sheet informed her that Mr. Moretti would be away on business indefinitely, and that her full authority at Verona's was to be respected without question. The message was cold, corporate, and utterly impersonal. It was a dismissal. She understood its purpose, a strategic, necessary severing to remove her from the line of fire. It was an act of protection, she told herself, but it felt like a surgical amputation performed without anesthetic. The void he had warned her about was no longer a threat. It was a cold, gaping reality. That night she stood at her small apartment window, watching the rain trace lonely paths down the glass, blurring the distant city into a watercolor of sorrow. The unfinished sketch of the Florentine bridge on her easel seemed to mock her, a relic from a simpler life that no longer existed. The quiet ticking of the clock on her wall was a maddening metronome, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time in his absence. The pain of his withdrawal was a physical ache in her chest, but beneath it, something new was taking root. It was a cold, hard lucidity, a clarity born from seeing the world and him for exactly what they were. Her heart was breaking, but her illusions were breaking with it. The whispers of the underworld had reached her, not in words, but in the atmosphere that now clung to Verona's. Strange men in dark suits would dine alone, their eyes never leaving her, their stillness a silent assessment. They were Dante's soldiers, a ghost army assigned to watch over her from a distance, their presence both a comfort and a constant, chilling reminder of the invisible war she was now at the center of. She was a protected asset, a strategic piece on a board she couldn't see. This detached, impersonal guardianship was all that was left of him, a cold echo of the man who had cupped her face with hands that knew both destruction and grace. Her fear began to transform, hardening from a paralyzing dread into a kind of resilient armor. The naive art student who had dreamed of Florence was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the brutal calculus of power and survival. She no longer saw Dante as a dark fairy tale prince, but as a man caught in the gears of a machine he had built himself, a man for whom violence and tenderness were two sides of the same tarnished coin. She had seen the monster and she had seen the man, and she was beginning to understand that they could not exist without each other. This knowledge did not absolve him, but it allowed her to see him whole, and in that she found a strange, sorrowful strength. In a sterile, minimalist mansion on the city's edge, a place devoid of personal touches, Dante fought his own war. Every waking moment was a battle against the memory of her. He saw her in the reflection of his whiskey glass, heard her voice in the silence between heartbeats. He would look at his own hands, remembering the feel of her skin, the fragile strength of her jawline, and a self-loathing so profound it threatened to suffocate him would rise in his throat. He had built an empire on control, on the suppression of all emotion. But this feeling for her was a rebellion from within, an insurgency of the soul that he had no weapons to fight, and the solitude he had once craved was now an unbearable torment. One evening, Alara found herself in front of her easel again. She picked up a piece of charcoal, her hand steady now. She thought of Caravaggio, of his violent life and his divine art, of his mastery of chiaroscuro, the stark, dramatic contrast between darkness and light. She finally understood it not as an artistic technique, but as a fundamental truth of the human condition. She began to draw, not the sunlit bridge of her dreams, but the memory of Dante's face in the aftermath of the violence, his eyes a vortex of torment and devotion. Her art was no longer an escape from her life. It had become the only way to make sense of it, to render the unbearable into something true. Weeks bled into a month. The black envelope remained the last and only communication. His corner booth at Verona's was kept permanently reserved, a silent, empty throne at the heart of her kingdom. The restaurant thrived under her command, a testament to the new, steely resolve she carried. But every night, as the last guest departed, the silence would rush back in, magnified by the void in that one corner. It was a silence filled with the echo of everything that had been left unsaid, a prolonged, aching pause in their story. She had been seen, protected, and then abandoned, left to wonder if the monster had finally consumed the man, or if he was simply waiting for the storm to pass. The first snow of winter fell over Chicago, a silent, cleansing blanket that muffled the city's roar. Months had passed, transforming the raw wound of Dante's absence into a quiet, silvery scar on Ilara's soul. She now moved through Verona's, not as an imposter, but as its undisputed queen, her quiet authority a force more potent than Valenti's blustering ever was. The fear had receded, replaced by a profound, melancholic understanding. She had seen the very heart of the underworld and had not been consumed by it. Instead, she had learned its language of shadows and silence, and, in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The corner booth remained empty, a silent memorial to the man who had both ruined and saved her, a constant, aching reminder of the ghost who still owned her heart. One crisp afternoon, a courier delivered a simple, unmarked manila envelope to her office. Her breath caught, her body tensing for a threat that never came. Inside, there was no typewritten note, no cold corporate directive. There was a single sheet of paper, thick and embossed with the crest of the most prestigious art restoration institute in Florence. It was an acceptance letter for a full 2-year scholarship, covering tuition, travel, and living expenses. All forms had been processed, all fees paid. It was a complete, finished dream handed to her in an envelope. A dream she had never applied for, a future she had long ago surrendered, as the price for survival in the world Dante had created for her. She sank into her chair, the letter trembling in her hand. There was no signature, no clue as to its origin, but she knew. She knew with a certainty that resonated in the very marrow of her bones. This was his handiwork. It was a gesture so far beyond mere protection that it took her breath away. He wasn't just keeping her safe from his enemies. He was setting her free from himself. He was meticulously, silently, giving her back the life he had interrupted, restoring the future he had inadvertently stolen that first night. This was not the act of a possessor, but of a redeemer. It was his final, most profound move on the board, sacrificing his queen not to win the game, but to let her leave it entirely. Miles away, in a car parked in the gray winter light down the street from Verona's, Dante watched the courier leave the building. He did not wait for a reaction. He did not need one. The act itself was his closure, a quiet, brutal penance. For months, he had orchestrated this from a distance, using layers of lawyers and shell foundations to build a bridge for her out of his world and into her own. Each step was an act of self-immolation, a deliberate severing of the only connection that had ever pierced his armor. To truly protect her integrity, he had to remove the stain of his own existence from her future. He started the car, the engine a low growl in the quiet street, and drove away, a king retreating into a self-imposed exile of shadows. That evening, Ilara stood in her small apartment, the acceptance letter on the table beside her easel. Her charcoal drawing of Dante's face watched her from the canvas, his eyes a permanent storm of conflict and grace. She looked from his image to the window, where the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city that held him. This gift was not an escape. It was a choice. She could stay in the kingdom he had built for her, a respected ruler in a gilded cage, or she could walk across the bridge he had built, back to the woman she was meant to be. She reached out and gently touched the charcoal cheek of the man in the portrait, a final, silent acknowledgement of the beautiful, terrible bond they shared, a farewell to her dark angel. His redemption was not in changing who he was, but in choosing to honor who she was, even if it meant an eternity of solitude. He had seen the light within her, and instead of extinguishing it, had shielded it from his own darkness until it could burn freely on its own. The story of their two worlds, forever bound by a single act of impossible grace, was now complete. If their journey into the heart of light and shadow moved you, show your support by liking and sharing the story. Let us know in the comments what you believe true love and sacrifice really mean. In the end, the most profound acts of protection are not about holding on, but about letting go.